Hey guys, we are going to go ahead and work through our review for our final exam here in PFT 102. So first things we're going to talk about is the idea of integrated training, right? Obviously that is what NASM is focusing on here. So integrated training is going to be a comprehensive, very systematic program that develops a high level of athlete while also preventing injury. The ideas here are that you are focusing primarily on functional strength, which is to say that it is using all three muscle actions, so concentric, eccentric, and isometric, and it's not just moving through one plane of motion, it's focusing on all of the planes of motion, sagittal, frontal, and transverse, versus your traditional style of training, which is more of a simplified version. This is basically just experts in the gym who had a lot of success in their own ways of working out, which is where personal training started, but obviously we've kind of branched out from there and taken a more scientific approach. Generally, traditional strength training was very focused on maximal strength gains, usually isolating muscle groups, only focusing on one thing at a time. Prime movers in particular, and it was typically very uniplanar. It was very, very, very sagittal plane heavy when it comes to the training. Also, you tend to only work on the concentric muscle action, so it's a lot of people like focusing on the super heavy lift and then just dropping and then doing maybe the next one. So we don't want to do that, right? We want to focus more on that integrated training because it's been scientifically proven to be much more effective and safe. So then we're going to kind of work our way through, do a quick review of some of our biomechanic terms here. So planes of motion is going to be our first one up, right? These are the three imaginary planes that divide us at right angles. You've got your sagittal plane, which is going to divide you into left and right halves, and you're going to move along that sagittal plane like so. So flexion, extension, those are examples of sagittal plane movements. Bicep curls, tricep extensions, things like that. Frontal plane movements are going to divide your body into, the frontal plane is going to divide you into front and back halves. So you're going to move along that plane this way. Good examples of that are going to be things like abduction and adduction, lateral flexion, and even like at your ankle, eversion and inversion are examples of frontal plane movements. Finally, we have the transverse plane, which is going to divide us into upper and lower halves. That is going to be any rotational movement. So even moving your head like this is an example of a transverse plane movement. Now, that's one thing that obviously, like I said, we are going to be focusing on all of those planes of motion in an integrated training program. We're also going to be focusing on the entire muscle action spectrum. So you've got your eccentric contractions, which are the contractions that your muscle is making when your muscle is lengthening, right? So these are contractions that are taking place during like a deceleration. This is also the first part of a stretch shortening cycle. You can think of this as like the loading phase, right? You're loading so that you can unload, right? Like it's a spring bunching itself up so that it can get ready to unspring. Then you have your isometric contractions, which are contractions that are occurring when your muscle is not changing length. Whenever we're talking about really explosive contractions, we have a special term to describe isometrics. We call that amortization, which is the transitional period that takes place between loading and unloading. So as you are sort of transferring your weight to go in the opposite direction, that's your amortization. The shorter amortization is, the better, because you're not going to lose as much energy in that isometric contraction. So what we want to do with amortization is try to keep that period as short as possible and transition from loading into unloading. So you want to go from eccentric into a rapid concentric. Again, that is very much a stabilizing action. That is the transitionary period. Then we also have concentric contractions, which are contractions that are occurring when your muscle is shortening. You can think of this as like force acceleration. You can think of this as force production, or it is the unloading phase, right? That's the final part in that stretch shortening cycle. So you would load eccentrically, transition isometrically, and unload concentrically. And that would be a lengthening, stabilizing, and shortening. So obviously, if we're talking about lengths, we have to understand a really big important concept related to optimal contractions are going to be length-tension relationships. And this is the relationship between like the resting length of a muscle. So every muscle has an ideal resting length from which it can produce the greatest amount of force. There's a really great overlap between like actin and myosin fibers here. So we want that length to be ideal. If a muscle's too shortened, the fibers are already kind of bunched bunched up, you're not going to be able to produce as much force. If the muscles are already really lengthened, they're not going to be able to get a very good overlap of actin and myosin fibers, and therefore you're going to lose force. So we want to have an ideal length tension relationship through like good posture and good biomechanics and things like that. Another term that's obviously very important is also understanding our force velocity curves. That basically states that like the ability of your muscle to generate force is going to be with increasing velocity. So you're going to lose force, but your velocity is going to increase. It's like when you start running, you're pretty slow, then you pick up some pace until eventually you sort of hit your top speed. So we want to think that there's an inverse relationship there. If you have high force, you're going to have low velocity. If you have high velocity, you're going to have low force. Now, obviously all of those are physiologic principles that we are sort of aiming for. Now we need to have kind of a way to like measure those things so that we can understand whether or not our client is going to have a good force velocity curve, good length tension relationships, and that's where assessments come in, right? Our three main categories that we talked about in this course were physiologic assessments, postural assessments, and performance assessments, which are obviously very key to athletics. So physiologic assessments are related to your overall health. These are things like your heart rate, blood pressure, things like that. Then you have postural assessments, which are very much related to like how your body is resting. And we know that, again, going back to that length tension relationship concept, ideal posture means ideal length tension relationships, which means, you know, ideal biomechanics, less chance for injury, and greater performance, right? Now, we also have our performance assessments, and these are assessments that are related to like a specific event. So these are things like stability, for instance, like a Davies test, right? That's testing upper body agility and stabilization. Strength, which is like a percentage of 1 rep max test. Power, which would also be very much related to a percentage of 1 rep max test. And then it could be speed, agility, or quickness tests, right? You could be doing running like a route and testing yourself on one day versus another. Or if you're doing like a Shark's skill test, right? That might be something that is directly related to your performance. The faster you do it, the more lower body agility and stabilization you have. Or it could be related to your conditioning. So if you are doing like a cardiorespiratory assessment, and your heart rate is recovering really quickly, well, then you are in, you know, excellent cardiovascular shape. But if it takes you a little bit more time to recover, then that shows that that is something that we can kind of work on. So once we kind of understand, like once we've sort of assessed our client and we know like what sort of things they need to work on, now we can sort of address like all of our different body parts. And so we'll look at flexibility training first and then work our way through the rest of the OPT template. So flexibility, obviously our ability to move a joint through its complete range of motion, is going to be affected by a lot of different things, right? It's going to be affected by your posture, your lifestyle, things like that. So that can alter your flexibility. It can alter your posture. And so some of the effects that we experience when we start to like stay in one specific position all day, or if we do a lot of repetitive motions, we can start to experience altered reciprocal inhibition, which is basically where one tight muscle is actually going to turn off its antagonist. So like if my hip flexors are really tight, for instance, that's going to decrease the strength that my gluteus maximus can produce, right? Because those two muscles are antagonists. If my biceps won't let go, my triceps can't do their job, right? So that's altered reciprocal inhibition. Now, when that happens, that's going to lead to synergistic dominance. Your body's going to try to recruit a different muscle to complete the same task, but it's not really designed to complete that task. So synergistic dominance is actually going to only further inhibit that underactive muscle. And so that occurs when like a synergist muscle actually takes over for a weak or inhibited prime mover, further inhibiting that muscle. So now what you end up with is you end up with, you know, the ability to kind of get the job done that you're trying to accomplish, but you're not really moving optimally. You're not really moving the way you're supposed to. And so you end up with a term called relative flexibility, which is a process by which the body finds the path of least resistance during a functional movement pattern, right? Now, you got the job done, you moved through the full range of motion, but your body wasn't really designed to move that way. So you might be putting undue stress on different parts of the body. That's going to lead to what we call arthrokinetic dysfunction, or joint dysfunction, right? And that's where the biomechanical dysfunction of two articular partners, aka your joints, right? Two bones coming together or more, that leads to abnormal joint movement. So it leads to your joints moving in a way that they're probably not designed. Shoulder impingement is a really good example of that. You end up with such tight muscles in your upper body that the space in between your scapula, collarbone, and humerus ends up getting all compacted, and then it starts to rub on soft tissues. So how do we actually fix this? Well, we're going to do different types of flexibility, right? We're primarily going to rely on two physiologic concepts. The first one is going to be autogenic inhibition. And autogenic inhibition is a physiologic process whereby the nervous system inhibits a muscle spindle due to the stimulation of a Golgi tendon organ. So what you're going to do is through either stretching or simple pressure, like in foam rolling, you are going to put pressure on a Golgi tendon organ, and that is going to turn off an overactive muscle spindle. That will inhibit it and allow that muscle to relax. Now you can get it to full length. So you've taken a shortened muscle and lengthened it back out to its normal length. We can also do that through a different process called reciprocal inhibition. And reciprocal inhibition is where when you contract an agonist, it will turn off the functional antagonist, or at least it's supposed to, right? Obviously, we just got done talking about altered reciprocal inhibition, which is where when you contract one muscle, it doesn't relax the other muscle, or the other muscle doesn't relax, and so then you lose some of your contraction strength. But with reciprocal inhibition, which is what we do when we do things like active isolated stretches, right? You are continually doing different contractions very intentionally over and over and over again. So you are trying to create reciprocal inhibition by telling your nervous system, contract this muscle, relax that one. And if it didn't work, well, that's okay. You get another rep coming afterwards. Contract this muscle, relax that one. Didn't work again, maybe you're still not getting very much range of motion. You're going to do, anywhere from 5 to 10 reps. So that's how we use reciprocal inhibition in active isolated stretches to improve our mobility. Now, if we start talking about cardio, we start talking about our energy systems, right? And your energy systems are basically describing how we as a biologic creature create a molecule called ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. And this is a very high energy molecule that our bodies produce, and our bodies use it as a fuel source. There's a lot of energy trapped within this molecule, and our body is able to break that molecule, release all of that energy, capture it, and use it to do metabolic work. So how do we actually produce that energy? Well, we've got two primary systems that we're going to do this with. We're going to do this with our anaerobic system, which is an energy system that does not require oxygen. These two versions are going to be your adenosine triphosphate phosphocreatine system, your ATP-PC system, sometimes called the phosphagen system, or it's going to be through glycolysis. And so both of those energy systems are going to produce ATP in the absence of oxygen. Those are your anaerobic energy systems. An for opposite and aerobic for, with oxygen. That is our anaerobic energy system. And that's your really intense lifting, right? That's a very short energy system. You can only remain anaerobic about 30 seconds in general. And so like anything that's longer than that is going to start to move you into your aerobic energy system, where your body will then actually absorb some oxygen in order to produce some ATP. And that's when you start breathing harder, in order to continue doing exercise. So your aerobic energy system is pretty complicated. It's going to consist of 3 different parts: aerobic glycolysis, which is sort of the stopgap where you're transitioning from anaerobic to aerobic, the Krebs cycle, sometimes called the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. And so each of those energy systems are going to be used. You can understand with all of that going on, that's very, very complicated. But the nice thing is that it produces a ton of ATP. So that is used for long duration types of activity. If you're doing something for 2 minutes or longer, you are very much training in your aerobic energy system. So then if we move on and we start talking about our movement preparation, which are things like core, balance, and reactive exercise, the first one we're looking at is the core here. Your core is going to be your entire lumbopelvic hip complex, right? It consists of stabilizing muscles, moving muscles, and muscles that attach to your appendages. And so we need to be able to use all of those together efficiently in order to produce effective human movement, right? So a lot of people tend to be pretty good at their movement system, but they tend to have a really underdeveloped stabilization system. So they're really good at moving their body around, but they're not so good at stabilizing their spine. And so that ends up leading to a lot of like low back injuries. So our job becomes to strengthen that local stabilization system. So the three main systems of your core are your local stabilization system, global stabilization system, and movement system. The local stabilization system are all the muscles that attach and stabilize your spine, your individual vertebrae. These are muscles like your transverse abdominis, your multifidus, the internal obliques, pelvic floor muscle, and diaphragm. You can kind of think of it as like a box that holds your spine in place, right? You've got the sides of the box, which are your internal obliques. You got the top of the box, which is your diaphragm, the bottom of the box, which is your pelvic floor muscles, the back of the box, which is your multifidus, and the front of the box, which is your transverse abdominis. Then on outside of that layer, you've got all the stuff that actually moves your spine around. So now that it's all stabilized, you got packing peanuts in there holding your spine in place. Now you've got all the stuff on the outside that's actually moving your spine in all of its different directions. That's your global stabilization system. Your six-pack muscles are a really good example of that. They're in charge of moving your spine, while your transverse abdominis, which is underneath that layer, actually holds your spine in place. And then you've got your movement system on the outside, which is actually attaching your spine and your pelvis to all of your different extremities. So your movement system includes things like your adductors, gluteal muscles, and even your latissimus dorsi. So then if we're moving outside of core training and we start working into balance, your balance is going to be defined as how far outside of your base of support you can maintain your equilibrium, right? How far outside of your base of support you can maintain your balance. And so when you were training for balance, this is going to work particularly on two main concepts. Your neuromuscular efficiency, which is the ability to recruit the right muscle at the right time, and your proprioception, which is all that information coming in. The nice thing about balance training is it's so wobbly, your brain is getting a lot of information. It's learning what this position means, that position, that one, that one, that one, that one, right? It's learning all this information coming in, and it's developing an understanding of what it has to do to get you back to neutral every time. So if you want to develop your proprioception, one of the best ways to do that is to continually train your balance systems. Next in our movement prep, the final section is going to be our plyometrics. This is sometimes known as reactive training, and these are really quick, powerful movements that are primarily focused on utilizing stretch shortening cycles, right? Stretch shortening cycle is where, again, you rapidly lengthen a muscle, which causes your nervous system to want to contract in the opposite direction. So the rapid lengthening triggers a rapid shortening in the opposite direction. So there's three phases to that plyometric. That is going to be your loading phase, which is the eccentric contraction, your transition phase, which we call amortization. That would be isometric in a normal contraction, but this one's very explosive. And then you have your unloading phase, which is a concentric contraction. Then after we're done with movement prep, we're going to move on to our speed, agility, and quickness training, or SAQ training. This is very sports specific. The idea here is that you are working on each of these individual athletic components. Speed, which is how fast you can travel in one direction as fast as possible. Agility, which is your ability to change directions without a loss of speed. And quickness, which is your ability to change body position and respond to some type of external stimulus. Now, speed is the one that really is the foundation for all of the others. You can't really have great agility unless you're quick, unless you're speedy. Can't use the word quick. And then you can't really have effective quickness if you can't get to the ball, So our components of a good speed program are going to be things like your stride rate and your stride length. So obviously you need to be able to move your feet really quickly, but if you go too quickly, you're going to lose length. And so then that's going to cause you to lose some of your speed. But if you're overstriding and you're taking too large of a step, that is also going to limit your speed because now your rate is going to go down. So it's kind of a balanced equation here, right? So your stride rate is how quickly you are taking steps, and your stride length is how long of a distance you are covering with every single step. Now, another really big important component of understanding how to move effectively are understanding your specific mechanics. You've got front side mechanics, which are the mechanics of your front leg, and you've got your backside mechanics, which are the mechanics of your back leg. So when you are taking a stride, your front side mechanics, you should have your spine in a neutral position. You should be performing hip flexion, knee flexion, and ankle dorsiflexion. So you should be pulling your toe up towards you when your leg is in the front. Then with your backside mechanics, your spine should still be in a neutral position, but you are going to do all of the opposite motions because you are accelerating with that back leg. So that's going to be hip extension, knee extension, and ankle plantar flexion instead of dorsiflexion. So those are our speed, agility, and quickness components there, right? Again, traveling from point A to point B as quickly as possible, changing direction as quickly as possible, changing body position as quickly as possible. So once we're kind of moving out of all of that and we get into sort of the main section, which is our resistance section of program design, we've got to understand like our general principles behind how we came up with some of these rules to follow, right? So that follows the principle of specificity, which basically states that the more specific a program you write, the more effective that program is going to be. The body adapts specifically to whatever type of demands you place upon it. That's why your clients have the posture that they have. Their body has been in that posture for a very long time. Their life is designed to give them that posture. So we say when we're describing the SAID principle, it stands for specific adaptation to imposed demands. Your body specifically adapts to whatever demands are imposed upon it, right? So the three things that your body is going to mainly respond to are mechanical, neurological, and metabolic. And so we have different types of specificity for each of those types of adaptations. We have mechanical specificity, which is the weight and the movements of the body. You've got neuromuscular specificity, which is the speed of contraction, and the exercise selection. Exercise selection refers to how stable the exercise is. So if you're choosing a stability ball chest press versus a bench press, right? And then metabolic specificity is the energy demand. How long are you under tension? How much rest are you taking, right? Now, all of those are going to describe the different ways that our body adapts. But we've also got an actual term for how we actually describe adaptation, and that is general adaptation syndrome, right? This describes how the body responds and adapts to specific types of stress. And it's a three-step process that we really want to focus primarily on the first two steps of. So you've got your initial alarm reaction, and the alarm reaction is the initial reaction to a stressor. So when you go to pick up like a super heavy barbell, initially your body is going to go, wow, that's super heavy. And so it's going to recruit a whole bunch of motor units. It's probably going to start producing some stress hormones like adrenaline, and it's going to recruit as much muscle as possible to overcome this high level of stress. Then a couple days later, your body is going to start going through what we call DOMS. That stands for delayed onset muscle soreness. That's a really good example of an alarm reaction. Your body goes, holy cow, the glutes got torn up. And so then it creates an inflammatory response with your immune system to sort of respond to that stress that we just created. But after you give it a little bit of time to rest, your body goes, okay, well, we're calming down now. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that the body is more resistant to damage next time this Yahoo decides to go pick up a barbell, right? And so that's where resistance development comes in. Your body has an increased functional capacity to that previous stressor, right? Your body goes, all right, well, if we're gonna get torn up like this, I'm gonna make some more muscle so that it's harder to tear down in the future. And that's great. We want to stay in those first two phases. The problem is sometimes we stay in one specific phase too long, or we start doing way too much stress. We don't give ourselves enough rest. And so we end up in this last stage of the general adaptation syndrome, which is called exhaustion. And that's where prolonged intolerable stress causes either staleness, so you might plateau, or it actually causes like an injury. If you do the same thing for too often, it might result in that system breaking down. And that's something we want to try to avoid. That's where our periodization comes from. And that's where all these different training systems that we're looking at here come from as well. This is like the variety that can keep things fresh and keep your body from plateauing. So looking at those resistance training systems, these are some fun ways to incorporate different ways of working out to apply different levels of stress. You know, for instance, circuit training and supersetting are two things that create like a lot of metabolic stress because you enhance your time under tension. You perform one exercise and then you keep going right into the next exercise. So there's a lot of metabolic stress there. Whereas like if we do like a pyramid system where you are maybe going up or down with the intensity, you are messing with the mechanical specificity. It's either getting really heavy or it's getting lighter every time. So it's really pushing the mechanical side of things. So of these systems, we've got a single set system, which is really good for beginners, and that's one set of repetitions per exercise. You're just going to introduce a new exercise. You're not going to do too much of it. It's not going to result in too much inflammation. Your client can kind of get used to the idea of working out. Traditionally, though, we're going to focus more on multi-set systems, and these are where you're going to do multiple sets per exercise. So when you hear the term like 4 sets of 8, for instance, that is where you are performing the same exercise for 8 repetitions 4 times with rest in between. Then we have a pyramid system. Pyramids are either going to be about 4 to 6 sets per exercise, but what's going to happen is that set's going to get heavier every single time, or it's going to get lighter every single time, which means you're either going to go up or down with the repetitions. If it's getting heavier, then the repetitions are naturally going to go down. If it's getting lighter, then the repetitions are naturally going to go up. We've also got superset systems. That's performing 2 exercises back to back with no rest in between. We actually use superset systems within the OPT model within 2 phases of training. In the strength endurance phase, you're going to do a superset technique. However, superset is just 2 exercises back to back with no rest. It could be things like push-ups paired with lunges. But in the strength endurance phase, and in the power phase for that matter, you are going to do 2 exercises back to back, and they're going to be for the same body part. And in strength endurance, you're going to pair a strength exercise with a stabilization exercise. So rather than doing push-ups paired with lunges, I would do a strength movement like a bench press, and I would pair that with a stabilization movement like push-ups. Now, if I were in the power phase, I would also use a superset technique, and I would also make sure that it's for the same body parts, but rather than pairing strength with stabilization, I'm going to pair a strength exercise with power. So I would do the bench press again, just like I did, because that's my strength chest movement. But then I would pair it with like a medicine ball chest pass, or maybe like plyometric push-ups, which was a power chest movement. We also have circuit training, which is where you're going to do multiple exercises in a row with as limited rest as possible in between each. So maybe you do something like push-ups followed by squats, followed by lunges, followed by pull-ups, followed by bicep curls, followed by some sit-ups, right? All of those in a row as fast as you can. And then at the end, you would take rest before going all the way back to the beginning of your set and starting over. Now, those are all things that you can do within each individual workout, but we also want to look at like a week, maybe a week-long period or a month-long period. This is where split routine systems come in. Rather than training every part of your body every single day that you're training, we would instead break them up into specific body parts. So if you were doing like your chest on one day, your back on another day, and your legs on a day after that, that would be a good example of a 3-day split. That is a split routine system. Now, 2 other ways that you can also move through your exercises. You have got what is called vertical loading and horizontal loading. Vertical loading is moving down the OPT for your sets. So you are allowed to rest here, but it looks very similar to circuit training. So if you were doing like a bench press followed by a barbell squat followed by a deadlift, right? In a horizontal loading system, it would be pretty traditional. Let's say you're doing 4 sets of 5 repetitions, right? You would do a set of the bench press, you would rest, then you would do another set of the bench press, and you would rest, bench press, rest, bench press, and then you would be done with that and move on to the next exercise, which would be barbell squats, right? So that is a horizontal loading system. You're moving through your sets like this, horizontally. A vertical loading system is moving vertically. So if you were to do your first set of the bench press, rest, then go do your first set of barbell squats, rest, then go down and do your first set of, what did I say? Was it pull-ups? Whatever. And then you were to rest, right? Then you would go all the way back to the top for your second set of the bench press, second set of barbell squats, second set of pull-ups, right? That would be a really good version of vertical loading. There's also one other rule in vertical loading. You generally will move from the upper body down to the lower body. So you will start with your chest, shoulders, upper back, biceps, triceps, then eventually move to the legs. Now, one specific type of lifting that is really good for our sports performance class is understanding the concepts of Olympic lifting. So Olympic lifting is an actual sport consisting of two events, which are the snatch and the clean and jerk, right? Both of these movements are really great because they are very explosive, they can be very, very heavy, and they're one of the best ways to enhance your client's power, which if you're training an athlete is absolutely key. So both of these exercises are going to move through what we call the universal athletic position, okay? That is basically a squat position, but it's particularly most sports move through extended versions of hip flexion or hip extension. So Olympic lifts are really great. However, they are a slightly higher risk exercise if you don't know what you're doing or if you don't have the proper prerequisites. And so your prerequisites for Olympic lifting are going to be things like flexibility and mobility. Obviously, if you don't have a good range of motion, you shouldn't be doing these movements. You need to have proper stability. So your core and your entire lumbopelvic hip complex should be plenty stable before attempting these movements. You should have proper posture. If you have altered length tension relationships, you're going to be recruiting the wrong muscles, which is going to make these movements risky. And you should have proper neuromuscular control. If you cannot balance while holding a barbell in any of the positions as you are moving through, you shouldn't be doing these lifts. So our two examples of these, like I said, are going to be the snatch and the clean and jerk. The snatch is an Olympic lift that pulls a barbell all the way from the floor into an overhead squat position, and it is the most explosive movement in the world of weightlifting. It is the highest power movement that we've got. The amount of power that you have to generate in order to get that barbell all the way up overhead is the highest required by anything out there. And then we also have the clean and jerk, which is a two-phase movement where you pull a barbell from the floor to your shoulders. Then you are going to dip down with your knees and hips and drive that weight up overhead. So both of these movements involve getting a barbell from the floor up overhead, but the clean and jerk gets to have a little pause right in the middle where you take it to the shoulders and then jerk it up overhead, which is why the clean and jerk is, much more weight compared to the snatch. Both of these lifts are fantastic exercises that I really think you should try to incorporate into your workouts as often as possible. They are most commonly used, though, in phases 4 and 5 because those phases are our most explosive. So that is pretty much everything for this whole course in, I don't know, however many minutes that was. Good luck, everybody. I'm sure you guys are going to kick some butt. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to give me a call or shoot me a text. And, for those of you guys who are moving on and becoming traders to the core and joining the Capstone group, we wish you the best of luck. And I'll talk to you guys soon. All right. See ya.